Okay, all right. Thanks everybody. So this is a talk on ThreeJS. I've called it Trippy Triangles in ThreeJS. So yeah, so the impetus for this is basically Toronto.js workshop, which is going to happen on the 13th. So I'm going to be kind of running that and stuff. And basically the format of that is it's like a live coding thing. So for the first kind of like 30 minutes, I kind of code and everyone copies what I'm doing. And then for the other kind of half, people kind of remix it and make it their own and stuff. So I was trying to figure out, like, what should I do? And I kind of wanted to do something very visual. And I'm a big fan of ThreeJS, and I've never really had a good excuse to play with it. So that's the motivation here. So that's my Twitter handle, What the Zach, and personal website, yeah. So there we go. So yeah, I kind of started off thinking, like, optical illusions are pretty fun. I'm a fan. It'd be really cool to figure out how to kind of do something like this in actual 3D. So yeah, I started, like, immediately I was just like, Google search fun optical illusions. You know, is there one that I can try and kind of replicate? So that was a pretty fun time, I have to say. So this one was pretty interesting. That's also kind of fun. A dog lady on the train, you know? And there was more fun stuff. A cop and a criminal in the same image. Those are just kind of vertically flipped, you know? It's the same picture. So lots of fun things. This one was also fun. It's a horse in front of another horse in sort of like an Alien vs. Predator style, you know? So that was cool. And then I started to think, like, oh man, I can't really make a horse, right? In ThreeJS. So I should probably, like, Horse.js. Oh, that's just like meme.js, basically. So yeah, so I started to think about, like, okay, MC Escher, right? Let's go there, right? That's lots of pretty fun optical illusions. This is one of the first things I came across, like, pretty beautiful, right? I don't even know how to describe it. I mean, like, I think there's swans. There's some sort of birds morphing with the fields, right? And I kept going, and I came across this. And then I started to think, okay, that's a little bit of geometry that I could pretty easily replicate in ThreeJS, right? Like, that's, well, it's impossible. It doesn't actually make any sense, right? But I know there's a trick. I know there's a trick, and there's a real geometry behind something like this, right? And I kept going, and this one was pretty fun, right? So I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I think this is what's called a Penrose square, or Penrose cube. It's something Penrose, right? And then I started to really zone in, right? And at the same time, I kind of was also aware of this game called Monument Valley. And I don't know if you kind of expected me to kind of reference it, but it's this beautiful game for iOS. It plays on this idea of kind of optical illusions. It's got a very unique style. It's like the colors are very flat. And it's very, very interesting, right? And they also are kind of like playing off the same sort of MC Escher style illusions. And I kept looking, and then I came across this. And then I started to think, okay, I could make something like this, right? So what is this? Like, so we've got a triangle, it's rotating, it's fitting with itself, you know? That's really cool. And it kept going. And it turns out this exact shape is what's called a Penrose Triangle. And I'm going to try and say this guy's name, Oscar Reutzfahrt. And I'm sure I butchered it, but yeah, so that's what that is. And it's a fun little shape. So I Wikipedia'd it. This is the Wikipedia image. So you can see this is what the illusion actually is. It's a real bit of geometry, and it's just sort of arranged and displayed for the camera in a way that, you know, it looks impossible, but it is actually a real shape. So I thought, okay, we can do this. And then I mentioned it to a friend, and he immediately said, that's the Verge logo. I was sort of disappointed, but not discouraged. So I kept going, and so this became my goal. So this is what we're going to build today in ThreeJS. It's this Penrose triangle with a slight kind of animation to it that kind of like shows you the real shape here. So okay, now comes the real code. So first of all, how are we going to do this? So we're going to bring in a 3D library. My favorite one, the kind of like most popular one I'm aware of is called ThreeJS. It's a great library. It makes it pretty easy to do kind of like 3D in the browser. You can have all sorts of different renderers. So Webgl, I think, is the most common one people use. You can also use Canvas and CSS 3D, all sorts of stuff. Excuse me. So yeah. So how are we going to do this? So the basic ingredients to kind of like a 3D scene via 3JS are a scene, a camera, a renderer, a light, and some sort of piece of geometry or mesh. And disclaimer, like, I have not used 3JS extensively. This is like 3JS 101. I'm sure a lot of this stuff is very basic to someone that's used this like in a more professional setting. This is very like experimental for me. So yeah, let's kick it off. So how do we make a scene? So very simple. 3.scene, right? Turns out this API has been around the block, right? Yeah, so then you make a camera. So one of the one they kind of like show in the docs is this perspective camera. So these four variables, basically the first one is field of view, the second one is the aspect ratio, then you have sort of like a clipping range. So 1 is like the near range and 2000 is like the far range. So your field of view, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, is the degrees of, like if you think of a camera, right? It's got this ray that kind of like extends out from a point in a couple different directions, and that kind of like, that angle is what you see in your camera, right? So, you know, this zone of what you see is called a frustum, I think. And this aspect ratio is the ratio of the height to width that is actually kind of displayed to you. So that's a very terrible description of the camera. But anyway, so we also have a renderer. So we're bringing in the Webgl Renderer, which is the kind of like standard one that people use. We're setting a size for it. And then this is kind of the guts of how you kind of like show it to someone on like a web page, right? You append it to the body. The renderer has like a DOM element, and you can kind of manipulate that however you want, right? That DOM element, it could be a canvas. Like basically in this case, it's a Webgl, instance. So yeah, so we have our renderer. One nuance to this is that you have to call render on that renderer at a certain rate, right? So request animation frame is a pretty standard kind of like browser primitive function, but you can think of it as this kind of like extended version of set interval. So set interval, like you pick a certain time and it continue executing on that time. Request animation frame is like that plus some goodies. So basically, like if you change the tab, it's going to stop rendering, whereas set interval would continue to render it. And the browser is actually even a little bit smarter than that. Like it can kind of say like, oh, we needed a couple extra frames here or there. Like it can kind of tell you when it wants to render, right? Based on when it's painting the browser field, right? So yeah, so that's that. And then there's also a light. We're using a super basic kind of like directional light. There's lots of different types. We're giving it a color and an intensity. And then we get to our geometry. So we have a box, we have a basic material, and the basic material and the box, the geometry, combine to form this mesh. And then we have to add that mesh to the scene. I should mention, so the light, like all the guts of this, each one of those we're adding to the scene. So everything gets added to the scene, and then you render the renderer, and the scene is on the renderer. That's the basics of this. So what does that look like at this point? Well, it looks terrible. Really bad. It's a big, giant kind of cube. I mean, you can see based on the outline of that it's a cube, I gave it a bit of rotation that I didn't really mention, but like you can see that it's a cube, but we're not doing really well, right? Like we want to get to this like this beautiful like optical illusion, and yeah, so we have our basics. So how do we get there? So I started thinking like, okay, we need to change a couple of things to give it that Monument Valley kind of look, right? And what are the basics of this, right? So one of them is that the camera is actually a different camera. So instead of a perspective camera, It's what's called an orthographic camera. And I'm also going to butcher the description of this, but basically what it means is that regardless of the distance, it's still kind of like rendering this piece of geometry in the same way. So if you've ever like gotten like so for example, a GoPro, you know, it's got this lens, this like fisheye lens, and that distorts everything around it, right? So most cameras are going to distort things that you see, right? But an orthographic camera kind of is the same to a certain extent, right? Again, terrible description, but it's a much flatter, much more geometric kind of camera. So that's that. And the other thing is we're going to change the material that we're applying to this box. So the basic material doesn't actually react to like a light source. It doesn't care. It just renders a certain color and that's it. So we're going to add what's called like a Lambert material. So this actually does react to a light source. So we had the light source, it wasn't really being used. Now we're changing the material and the material can react to it. And we're giving it a different color. We are applying like a flat shading. So we aren't going to get like really crazy gradients to a certain extent. It's still going to be like a flat color, but we will have it react to the light source. And then on our renderer, I don't know if I'll actually go back. So where are we? Ooh. So you can see it's super jagged as well. Like it isn't really like these clean lines, right? So yeah, that's also kind of shit. So yeah, so this is where we're at now. It's like kind of anti-aliased, you know. We have like a nice, you know, cute box. And from that, we can finally build this kind of like optical illusion. And now comes the fun part where I skip over a whole ton of really gratuitous like positioning and stuff. So I'm just going to explain like the nuances of like the fun parts of the geometry that we're going to add, right? So in this initial shape, we had kind of like these rectangles, right? So really what is that? That's two boxes, or rather three boxes, and then like kind of a plane and then a rectangular shape, right? So I'm not going to kind of like go through the nuances of the box parts. Basically, we're just making it longer, we're positioning it in a certain way, we're rotating it. That's relatively simple. But what I will talk about is this kind of new bit. So this is what it looks like to add a plane. So instead of like a box, it's just a different piece of geometry. This time I'm using actually a buffer geometry. So if you're concerned about performance, fun fact, there's like alternative sets of all this geometry that actually buffers a lot of the nuances, right? So within these scenes, there's like all sorts of stuff that you can bake into these materials and these meshes that's going to save you a lot of computational power. So definitely if you're looking at doing this, the buffer geometry is going to kind of help you quite a bit. And yeah, and the other part is I kind of cheated a little bit. I added this kind of like triangular shape. So it is also like a plane, but it's just a triangle. And this is how you kind of do that. And this is how you would create any sort of like piece of geometry off of like a 2D shape, right? So I create 3 vectors. From those, I create these kind of vertices. With the vertices, I get a face. I compute the normal to the face, which is kind of like this perpendicular value. And with that, I can then create my mesh. So now I have this wonderful mesh. And magic step, this is where we're at. So we have an optical illusion, right?
That was so easy.
Yeah. Yeah, so definitely come to the workshop if you don't want the BS magic right there. But yeah, no, but this is cool, right? But it's not really moving much. Like we know that it's an optical illusion, right? We know that that's actually a 3D shape. It's not actually impossible, but you can't really see it right now, right? So how will we do that? How will we animate this in a way that's actually gonna like make sense? So here we go. So one good tip is before you animate it, you want to animate all of these different pieces of geometry as one piece. Or in this case, that's what we want to do, right? So you can actually group, like through 3JS, all this geometry into one. So I do that. So I create a new 3.group. I add each one of these bits of geometry to it. I set a basic rotation. And then so new timeline max. So that's actually like an animation library called timeline max. I mean, there's lots like it, but that's what I'm using here to kind of do this animation. And
sock, right? That's green sock, right?
That is green sock, the sock of green. Yeah, it's great. It's a great library. They've got a whole suite of different tools for animation. Definitely worth leveraging. Like that's so. I mean, it's. I think it's. I want to like say it's Grant Skinner. Some of his sort of tooling out of Edmonton. I don't know if that's true. It might just be coincidence, but. Yeah, I love that guy. But anyway, so this is how you do it. So you go so we create a new timeline max instance, and then we go timeline.to. We set what we're changing, right? So we're changing the rotation of that group. Rotation in the world of 3JS is in radians. So 3JS, thankfully, I don't have to do this calculation. I can just, they've got a convenience function that lets me do that, degrees to radians math. So I just set, with that convenience function, I just set the degrees that we're going to change this to, and then I give it an easing function that describes how we're going to do it. So expo.easeout is that sort of magic easing function, and then I do the same thing back to the original position. So that'll give us this kind of like feeling of it moving and then moving back and kind of like resetting, right? So after doing this, we end up with this. So yeah, it's pretty close, right? And that's it. Yeah. And that's the talk. Okay. Thanks, everybody. Questions? Adam?
So what's next? What's your next step in taking these optical illusions to the next level?
The next level? The next optical level?
Yes.
I have no idea. What do you think it should be?
If you drew out the geometry yourself as opposed to using pre-made cubes, that'd be cool.
Oh.
Yeah. So basically, like you say, put the vertices here, and then you fill it in.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that'd be.
That sounds fun.
So like interactively, or?
Well, interactively, sure, but like instead of using like cubes, being like drawing lines and then filling.
That'd be fun.
Yeah.
So there's another library that I wanted to do a thing on called Paper.js, which is kind of like a fun vector 2D library. So doing something like this kind of like illusion in a 2D library like that would also be super interesting. So yeah, that'd be fun.
How well does 3JS support importing external meshes?
So again, I'm kind of a beginner to 3JS. I haven't used it extensively. I know there are functions to import meshes, and it'll kind of like create this set of geometry for you. I was kind of manually creating these vertices and stuff. Like there are tools to make that a little bit more convenient. But I'm not aware of the nuances of how to do it.
Pretty sure you can import from Blender and Maya.
Import from Blender and Maya? Okay.
OBJ meshes.
Be beautiful.
Pretty well standard.
OBJ.
Right on.
OBJ. Okay. Cool. Was there another question over? No?
I have a question. So
Go
for the Monument Valley game, do you
Yeah.
think the developer did the shape and the rotation one by one, like hard-coded out? Or is there some easier way for him to do it?
I have no idea.
Okay.
I imagine I imagine
This
that's
is
like
very-
some pretty good tooling.
Right.
Like I can't imagine they're going,
Exactly.
bit by bit to really, zone in on that geometry, right? Like I imagine they had some artists and they kind of like had a set of clean tools that made it easy, but I'm just imagining that. So
How did you figure all that out? Like that was really cool, and like it seems really complex. There's a lot of concepts. Like how did you approach it?
So I think I was mentioning to you, Dill, one of the really cool things about 3JS and just JavaScript generally, there's lots of code out there, right? So I kind of tried to, I did kind of a Google search of what's out there, right? And what's really amazing is, so CodePen has tons of these different snippets out there, right? So one of the first things I did was, I looked at okay, I wanted to do an optical illusion, and then I went on CodePen and I tried to see like what other people were doing, and then I started to zone in on how people were kind of approaching things with ThreeJS, right? So, after I got a basic scene going, like that like shitty green cube, right? I was kind of trying to think like, I have no idea how I'm going to get that effect, right? So I went on CodePen and I just said like, okay, let's just look up some cool like things people have done with ThreeJS and try and understand, which cameras did they use, which kind of shaders, and that really was kind of a guide for me to get this type of look that I wanted. And from that, I could then manipulate the geometry to create this illusion. I mean, I had the geometry already because I could just see how it was set up on Wikipedia. So, I created the basic shapes and then I kind of like tweaked it a little bit to get it the way I wanted. And then after that, the animation part was pretty simple. So.
And was it the docs that like got you there's a camera, there's a renderer, there's like a...
Yeah, so the docs will set up the basics of a scene for sure. Those they're a great kind of starting point for sure. So yeah, that tells you that's kind of like the best first step. I mean, ThreeJS has been around a long time. Like I think at least like I want to say 2010, like a long time. So yeah, it's a great set of tools, and the guy behind it, I think he goes by like Mr. Doob or something like that.
Yeah.
Great name, awesome man. He used to do a lot of work in Flash, and I started out like doing a lot of kind of like work with ActionScript in Flash. So I knew him from that era. And then he started to shift pretty heavily into JavaScript, and I was still kind of following him. And then he started to do ThreeJS. So I was kind of aware of him for a long time, and you can see a lot of the interesting things. So yeah, that's kind of the story.
Where do you get your fantastic like pixel gifs from?
I can't reveal my sources. Can't tell you. Message me and I'll send you some. Yeah.
Polyhack Slack.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Okay.
Poly Slack.
Thanks, everybody.